Hey guys, it's the Metal Blade 5, and everyone loves a good crossover, right? The moment of having two or more series you'd never expect to meet and having its characters interact with one another can be a very exciting time for fans of any of them. Of course, there are some crossovers that make a lot of sense, and some that are really weird. And there seems to be no greater abundance of the latter than in the media of video games, with the seemingly increasing rate of games crossing over or collaborating with some of the most random things you can imagine, further cementing that notion. So I'd like to take the time to go over what I think are arguably the 10 weirdest crossovers that have happened in games. But as there could be so many to choose from, I need to lay down some ground rules first. I'm going to refrain from including any super famous crossover games from this list, as they're such low-hanging fruit to begin with, and I feel their mainstream recognition has somewhat normalized them to the point that they don't feel that weird anymore. I'm also avoiding any crossovers that are solely between franchises owned by the same company, since they aren't as weird as some others when you really think about it. And lastly, I am allowing crossovers with non-video game IPs, but the primary IP that is being crossed over still has to be a video game, otherwise it's not so much of a game crossover. This one will make more sense when you actually see the list. Then in contrast, for the list criteria, it's simply down to a combination of how weird the crossover is and how it was executed. So with all that established, it's time for some crossover chaos, as I count down what I believe to be the top 10 weirdest crossovers in video games. As crossovers in games have become less scarce, the one genre that has contributed the most to that fact is fighting games, primarily through the inclusion of guest characters. Almost every modern fighting game seems to have one, but this practice actually dates back a long time ago, with one of the earliest examples being a little game called Argyle. Released in 1998, this is a 3D fighting game developed by Dream Factory and published by Namco, with a couple of similarities to Tekken. I mean, one of the fighters is just a mishmash of numerous Tekken characters. On the surface, it appears to be no more than your typical 3D fighting game of the time. You know, nothing unusual. That is, until you get to the character select screen and learn there are Final Fantasy VII characters in this game! Cloud and Tifa appear as guest characters in the arcade version, while the PlayStation port then added Sephiroth, Yuffie, Vincent, and Zack. Why do they do this? I have no idea! At first glance when you start the game, it looks like they were making some new original IP with nothing remotely Final Fantasy-like at all, and then out of nowhere someone thought, let's add Final Fantasy! Cause in addition to how odd they look when side by side with the original characters, aside from having Cloud on the box art of the PlayStation port, they don't exactly advertise that there are Final Fantasy characters in it, which makes their appearance feel even more random. Not to mention how seeing these characters throwing hands in a traditional fighting setting was already weird enough, especially when this was before Dissidia became a thing, but they also have most of them fight very differently to how they normally do. Like, having Cloud fight Sephiroth defaults to them punching each other, and then you can switch them using their swords to be more traditional. Or Vincent being a clone of God Hand, so he uses mostly Tekken moves and hardly any guns. What's more is how, in spite of this being one of the earliest instances of guest characters in fighting games, it goes beyond almost every instance since then with the number of fighters from one series present. After the additions on the PlayStation, there are 6 of them amongst a total roster of 17. It's not far off from the point where you could consider this almost a complete crossover that you'd usually see. Quite the insane effort for a game that would later fall into obscurity. And then, almost 20 years later, Noctis appears in Tekken 7. It's like it's come full circle. A common trend with games nowadays when featuring other franchises without being a full-on crossover title is the art of the collaboration, as popularized by Fortnite, which has collaborated with everything under the sun. But just a year prior to Fortnite's debut, there was a game released and already doing similar kinds of collaborations to slightly less fanfare in the form of Dead by Daylight. a survival horror game set in the style of slasher films that has players attempt to survive from another player acting as the killer. On its own, it's a simple premise, but its appeal was definitely elevated further by its collaborations, which are mainly done through the inclusion of additional survivors and killers, many of whom follow the game's inspirations and come from actual horror films. Like, they've got Michael Myers, Ghostface, and Freddy Krueger among those you'd kind of expect to see, some of them being added alongside the protagonist of their films as survivors. And moving slightly more out there is the likes of Pinhead, the chick from The Ring, and even Ash Williams appearing as a survivor, making this almost like a horror all-stars game. But a lot of those I'd imagine the average person guessing would appear anyway under this context. What really helped to put this game on the list is when they started to step outside of strictly horror films. Examples include Silent Hill content with Pyramid Head as a killer, Resident Evil content with Nemesis and Wesker as killers, and even characters from Stranger Things, featuring the Demogorgon as yet another killer. To put that into perspective, this is a game where you can witness Steve Harrington being chased down by Nemesis. Infinity War is the most ambitious crossover, my ass. Then what helped to further cement its place on the list is how it gets even weirder when you see that they've collaborated with franchises that aren't even horror at all. Remember how Fortnite collaborated with Attack on Titan? Well, somebody else beat them to it. But trumping even that and everything else before is how recently they announced that for a new survivor, they're adding Nicolas Cage to the game. 'Cause why not? When, where, how did this come about and get approved? Either way, I'm loving every second of it while watching from a distance. Somebody's acid trip of having Nicolas Cage face off against Leatherface has now become reality. The Mario Kart series is by and large the most famous of all the many Mario spin-off series. Yet in spite of the series' iconic status, there is one corner of it that not a whole lot of people know about, and even I only learned of by complete accident. There is a sub-series of Mario Kart exclusive to arcades called Mario Kart Arcade GP, consisting of 4 games. To put it simply, it's just Mario Kart on arcades, with some changes here and there to adapt to arcade systems, like the tracks being overall shorter and more basic, and even a few original items like, is that a frying pan? So why exactly is this being brought up on a countdown about crossovers? It's actually a crossover with Pac-Man. Despite clearly being called Mario Kart, being a sub-series of a franchise that at the time of the first free arcades releases only featured Mario characters, and even Mario being so predominantly featured on the arcade machines while Pac-Man is often tucked into the corner, due to these games being developed by Namco, they decided to use this opportunity to make it a crossover between the two companies' mascots, before they even tried to give Pac-Man his own racing game. Which I just found so peculiar understanding why they went with that approach and imagining how confused an average arcade goer would be upon booting this up, expecting it to be just an adaptation of Mario Kart, and then seeing Pac-Man there. Not even with any fanfare, he's just there. It's like when they have Mario and Sonic meet for the Olympics. They have all these iconic characters collide, only for some benign sport and act like they've known each other all along. Pac-Man also didn't come alone, as the games also included Miss Pac-Man and Blinky as playable characters, alongside a bunch of tracks from the Pac-Man series, well before Mario Kart 8 made having tracks from other series cool. Though in the subsequent games, they never bothered to add the rest of the ghosts, which I find odd. Instead, the next 2 games added a character from a different IP owned by Namco Bandai. The 3rd game had Dawn, the mascot of the rhythm games Taiko no Tatsujin, that are much more iconic in Japan, complete with his own theme track. But even weirder was who the 2nd game added. Mamachi, a Tamagotchi. We're not even crossing over with video games anymore, and they still treat this as perfectly normal. However, it seems Mario and Pac-Man had a falling out, as for the 4th game, there were no Namco characters at all. It sort of lost its crossover identity, and even though it was bizarre, it kind of bums me out to see that. Believe it or not, but Mario Kart isn't the only Mario spin-off series to randomly cross over with another franchise. And this one I think is a little bit weirder too. In fact, for this entry, we have two mostly different games that both just so happen to cross over with the same one. After already competing in a bunch of sports by this point, Nintendo decided to branch out into more, starting with Mario Slam Basketball, as it's called in Europe, and then brought basketball back along with some other new sports in the follow-up game, Mario Sports Mix. Simultaneously, Nintendo chose to branch out when it came to the development team, as this time, the games were developed by Square Enix. So you know what that means. Final Fantasy characters randomly showing up in other games again! Here it's mostly those from the very first Final Fantasy, wherein they go by their class names, that being the Ninja, the White Mage, and the Black Mage, with the others being a Moogle and a Cactuar. So those who slightly fit more aesthetically with the Mario cast, even though they still look really out of place next to them. But regardless, the concept of Final Fantasy characters playing sports is weird enough to think about and look at that it made it onto the list. And when it comes to the very early Final Fantasies that most of these characters debuted in, they were basically your standard medieval fantasy setting. So we take them from that setting to partake in the medieval art of basketball! And again, these games don't really advertise the fact that they are crossovers, so I can perfectly imagine some kid buying these games thinking it would be a usual Mario sports game, only to then have Final Fantasy show up out of nowhere. Sports Mix builds on this further by including a story that is kicked off by Toad discovering a bunch of Final Fantasy crystals containing a basketball, volleyball, dodgeball, and a coin to use as a hockey puck. Somehow, and with no question, decides to organize tournaments for those 4 sports. And upon completing all 4 tournaments, you end up in a boss battle against the Behemoth, who you must defeat by throwing bob-ombs at while still playing volleyball. Just roll with it. And to top it all off, Sports Mix also included Slime as a playable character, which means that it's also a crossover with Dragon Quest, somewhat trumping the other time Mario has crossed over with Dragon Quest in the weird factor. Maybe this was how Nintendo's fetish for Square Enix truly came about. So as Mario has made it onto the list twice now, it's time to let Sonic have his turn. And in this instance, he was able to outperform his rival. After Sega already had Sonic crossover with characters from some of their other series to play tennis, they did so again with more series to race each other in Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing, where they even had Banjo and Kazooie appear in the Xbox 360 version. But they went even crazier with the sequel 2 years later, Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed. Copying Mario Kart 7 this time around, it primarily follows the same setup of the last game of having the Sonic cast and characters from other Sega franchises racing in vehicles. I guess so Sonic doesn't destroy everyone else in the race. Even when you solely look at the Sega characters, it's already weird enough, especially with the additional ones in the PC version like General Winter from Company of Heroes 2, a strategy game set in World War II, giving you a Soviet soldier racing in a tank, and Willimus from Total War Rome 2, an ancient Roman soldier driving in a car that can transform into a boat and a plane, all of which he knows how to operate. But if it was only that, then it wouldn't meet the criteria. As you may have noticed, this game dropped the Sega from the All-Stars part of the title, and that's because this game includes a few more non-Sega races than the previous one. Not many, admittedly, but it was certainly quality over quantity here, as they are especially random and unexpected picks that make me curious on how the behind-the-scenes discussions went. First up, Wreck-It Ralph is in it, an animated film character. This was the same year the first film came out, which Sonic does cameo in, so maybe this was part of the deal? But it's still really weird nonetheless. But not as weird as having Danica Patrick. You know, the real-life race car driver? I don't have any idea what kind of deal was made to get her in, Then also exclusive to the PC version are the Heavy, Pyro, and Spy from Team Fortress 2 all rolled into one. Putting aside the weapons and bloodshed that is all they know for some friendly racing against a Mexican monkey. And lastly, as part of a charity fundraiser, for DLC, they later added Yogscast, the YouTuber. I can say that a YouTuber has been in the game with Sonic and have it not be a lie. What's next? Markiplier and Yakuza? Imagine if they made another one of these. Just think of all the people they could add. Maybe they could get Nicolas Cage to join in too. With collaborations being all the rage at present, I think it's time that I acknowledge the series that was somewhat of the catalyst for its later popularization, and what I consider to be the low-key king of collabs. Monster Hunter. For a series with the premise of simply killing monsters, it quickly became a magnet for collaborations with franchises across dozens of mediums. I can't even cover a fraction of the collabs they've done without having the section drag on longer than it should. So if you'd like to see most of them and in more depth, I'd suggest watching dedicated videos on this subject. While here, I'll be going over the ones that stood out to me the most. All of these collabs come in the form of either armor, weapons, and/or unique monsters to fight. Obviously, there are a lot of collaborations between other Capcom franchises, but it extends well beyond that as everyone else wanted to get in on the action. Like many Monster Hunter games on Nintendo consoles has a collab with one or more Nintendo series. Then there's also Sonic costumes in several games, Dawn the Drum returns in the form of a hammer, there was some Horizon Zero Dawn equipment in World, and of course, Final Fantasy showing up. They've also brought various Japanese artists, including manga artists, to design armor, which alongside them collabing with several manga publishers, means there's a lot of anime here. Attack on Titan, again, One Piece, Sailor Moon, Evangelion, Fate, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Fairy Tail, Sergeant Frog, and even Madoka Magica, just to name a few, and many of whom make you look very out of place, though sadly many of these collabs were Japan exclusive, including the crazy Diamond Hammer! Also, Frontiers had a unique monster in the form of the Fishman, a creature from the horror manga Higanjima. And last, but certainly not least, of some of the most notable ones that also debuted in Frontiers are a costume of Hatsune Miku with her own weapon that plays her music, and somehow, one of the earliest collabs they ever did was with Pizza Hut. For a limited time, ordering at Pizza Hut in Japan would give you a code for a pizza longsword, which I would much rather eat than the monsters. Again, this was only covering a small number of collabs they've done across the series, so you can also take note that this was all just the tip of the iceberg. Seeing as Namco love to put guest characters into their games, which have only become more well-known and out of left field as time has gone on, I think it's only appropriate that arguably their most surprising cases of this should make it onto the list. And it all stems from their other 3D fighting game series, Soul Calibur. Despite being largely overshadowed by Tekken in terms of recognition, Soul Calibur gained a long head start over Tekken when it came to its own crossovers. As with Soul Calibur 2, 4, and every numbered game thereafter, there has been at least one guest character. 2 had one of 3 different guests depending on which version you played. The PlayStation 2 version had Heihachi, the GameCube version had Link, and the Xbox version had Spawn. Don't know what the correlation there is, but they beat Mortal Kombat to the punch. Then 5 featured Ezio from Assassin's Creed, whereas 6 included Geralt from The Witcher, and later on the DLC added 2B from Nier Automata, as well as Haomaru from Samurai Showdown. Even the random Wii spin-off game continued this trend by having Lloyd Irving in it, as well as the PSP spin-off which had Kratos as a fighter, again preceding Mortal Kombat. They've got characters from a whole bunch of popular video games, one being based on a book, as well as a dark comic book character. It can't get any weirder than that. It can. The biggest, most unexpected guest appearances in the series came when Soul Calibur 4 crossed over with Star Wars, featuring Darth Vader, Yoda, and Starkiller from the Force Unleashed games, bringing a Star Destroyer stage along with them. They somehow managed to negotiate the rights to some of the most iconic characters in all of science fiction, and put them in a fighting game that is supposed to be set in like the 16th century. And looking past the sheer notoriety of the IP in question, it's so jarring to see them go toe-to-toe with fighters using historical or magical weapons against lightsabers. And like other entries before, they treat this as completely normal. There does not appear to be a limit for how far Soul Calibur can and will go to get some of the craziest guests. Now, if only they could all be in one game to up the ante way more than it already is. And whenever they decide to make a Soul Calibur 7, I'll be really interested to see who makes it onto that one. Another franchise that has gotten a ton of spin-offs following its massive success is Pokemon. However, in their case, they've spun off so much that they have a game for almost every genre you can possibly think of. Yet one of the most unexpected genres they turned to, which just so happened to have an incredibly weird premise to boot, came about in 2012 on the DS, and it was known as Pokemon Conquest. This game is a crossover with Nobunaga's Ambition, a strategy RPG series by Koei Tecmo. As such, this too is a strategy RPG drawing many elements from that series for its gameplay, replacing human soldiers with Pokemon under the command of human soldiers, as the armies across 17 kingdoms wage war on one another. When only a year later, the horrors of a past war involving Pokemon became a plot point, they made it so happy and fun to experience here. It is set in the Ransei region, based on feudal Japan, in which the kingdoms are attempting to unite the region through conquest in order to call forth Arceus as part of some legend. And the objective is for your player character, who is the warlord of the Aurora Kingdom, to find a peaceful means of ending the conflict. Or rather, you take over all the other kingdoms by force, battling against all their warlords who, much like Nobunaga's Ambition, are based on actual Japanese generals from history, with many of the events that happened in the story also being inspired by the actual historical events. Only this time, they have Pokemon. Even Oda Nobunaga himself appears in the game as the main villain with Zekrom as his Pokemon, with his ambition being to kill Arceus to bring about peace due to it being the driving force behind the war. Man was prepared to take down gods, but as you get there first and obtain Arceus, you now have the power of God and anime on your side to defeat him, which swiftly prompts the region to go back to its peaceful ways and return each kingdom's independence. Guess that's one way of solving that dilemma. Yeah, pretty much every aspect of this game is ridiculous. The premise, the setting, the characters, the story, and the obviously clashing tones between the two series that they somehow managed to pull off. Now imagine if they went the opposite direction and had its tone closer to Nobunaga's. That could have been dark as shit. Seeing as both collaborations and guest fighters have now appeared twice each as well so far, it makes it amusing that this entry ends up being about somewhat of a crossover between those two formats, which is already a bit odd in of itself, but goes the extra mile by becoming what I think is the most bizarre group of guest characters in a singular game I've ever seen. And it's all centered around one of the unlikeliest of places people would expect it to this extent to occur, being the King of Fighters series. What fittingly began as a crossover between SNK's franchises that later became the only place those characters would appear for the next 20 years, decided to go beyond the boundaries of the norm for the series with its own spin-off, The King of Fighters All-Star. A mobile game that is a beat-em-up instead of a fighting game, where you can pick from an ever-growing roster of characters who have appeared across the King of Fighters series. I did not intend for that to sound like an advertisement. But as more content and characters were gradually added, SNK started to look outside of their own franchises and seek other companies' characters to join the fray. And for some of these, they turned towards some strange areas. And were successful. Not too surprisingly, they crossed over with other fighting games. Street Fighter, Tekken, and Virtua Fighter are all in here. And as is the case with every collaboration in this game, they feature numerous characters from each series rather than just one, meaning this also goes further than the usual guest fighter appearance. But they've also featured fighting games outside of the most iconic ones. Soul Calibur is also present here, as well as Dead or Alive and even Guilty Gear, despite being in a completely different style to all the others. Meaning we're only a few away from having this become a crossover between every famous fighting game series, which is absolutely insane. Yet I've only just scratched the surface. They also collaborated with a game called Seven Knights, a Korean RPG series that was made by the same studio who developed this game. However, they didn't stop at just video games, as they too have collaborated with anime. Specifically, Gintama and Seven Deadly Sins, both of which being especially out of place given how neither of them have anything to do with martial arts. One is a sci-fi comedy while the other is a fantasy, and none of their characters really fit the tone of King of Fighters. But even past that, there is still one collaboration that delves even deeper into absurdity, being when they collaborated with WWE. Thus, there are real-life wrestlers in this game, like John Cena, The Undertaker, and The Rock. The hierarchy of power in the King of Fighters universe is about to change. The thumbnail of this video perfectly encapsulates how off-the-wall of a crossover this game is. You've got Devil Jin, Akuma, John Cena, Gintoki, and Meliodas all in the same place. Something that would never happen in my wildest dreams. All we need now is Nicolas Cage. We have all these mediums, fictional universes, and real life being pulled together in a semi-ignored mobile game of all things. And yet it is still not the weirdest crossover on this list. Okay, so I'm gonna need to provide some additional backstory for this entry to fully establish why this crossover is so weird. Cause honestly, the crossover itself isn't that weird compared to almost every previous entry, but the execution alone is what elevated it all the way up to the #1 spot. Picture yourself 10 years ago, watching the January 2013 Nintendo Direct, and seeing the announcement of a game that is to be a crossover between Shin Megami Tensei and Fire Emblem. Then complete silence on the game for the next 2 years until, on the 1st of April no less, you are greeted with this.
What the hell is this?
It is finally revealed proper under the English title of Tokyo Mirage Sessions Sharp FE. Rather than being a traditional crossover of characters like what the announcement teaser led everyone to believe, it is instead a crossover of mechanics from the two series, with it essentially being more of a Persona game than a mainline Shin Megami Tensei, with the personas being Fire Emblem characters, having some Fire Emblem mechanics thrown in like the weapon triangle, and the premise being based around the Japanese idol industry. You have a party of idols and aspiring idols in present-day Tokyo who, while trying to develop their careers, are able to travel into an alternate dimension called the Idolosphere that is home to many shadows and mirages of Fire Emblem characters, both good and evil. The evil ones are trying to steal the real-world population's performa, which is their artistic energy, to use as an offering to resurrect Medius. While the good ones bond with our heroes to make them Mirage Masters in a magical girl transformation sequence that's kind of Awkward. They then use their mirage powers to fight against the performer-stealing antagonists and to stop the real world from being destroyed by Medius. Now, if you thought all of that had hardly anything to do with either Shin Megami Tensei or Fire Emblem, you'd be right. Additionally, it is all made even weirder by how exactly they chose to execute these aspects of the story. Like how outlandish many of the Fire Emblem characters' designs are compared to their usual selves. Like, look what they did to Garnath. They turned my man into a disco ball. Party members and supporting characters having their own side stories that are like a fusion of social links, support conversations, and general RPG side quests that usually end with some super kawaii desu J-pop song or acting scene that is very off-putting, which then gets translated into a skill in combat that is also very off-putting, and is somehow able to create shit like ice tornadoes. Coupled with all the awkward anime tropes present elsewhere, like in the actual story scenes, Tiki acting as a Vocaloid who cranks up the lolly vibes to 11, and this man who I am shocked is not on some kind of register. As someone who has actually played this game, only because of it being related to Fire Emblem I must clarify, even I found myself cringing at these kinds of moments. The whole tone and setting are both super cheesy and strange for even Shin Megami Tensei standards. They made this game much more upbeat than your typical Shin Megami Tensei because they thought it would fit better with Fire Emblem for some reason, but the modern day setting that is also reflected in most of the idolosphere, along with the weird dungeon ideas and story themes, made it not fit with that either. So they end up contradicting one another. And of course, the goddamn idol stuff was so alienating to everyone. All of this resulted in the game pulling a Morbius and bombing twice. Then some of the characters appeared in the shitty mobile game and were never seen again. I used to be more defensive of this game in my teens by separating the gameplay from the idol premise in my mind, but when I look back on this game nowadays after playing Persona myself, I'd say it's okay. It basically is just a watered-down Persona game. The battle system is good, and there were a few characters who I found likable, but there are plenty of others who I thought were uninteresting. The story was incredibly dumb and underdeveloped, whilst lacking in the strong, overarching themes that drive Persona narratives, and there's a lot content-wise that just feels missing by comparison, even with some cool implementation of Fire Emblem mechanics in their place. Then layered with all the weird weeb stuff I've covered on top, which became harder for me to ignore. I imagine how this game could have performed and been received so much better if they had just made it a traditional crossover. But with how absurd the direction they took this concept in, from its inception all the way to its execution, makes it what I believe to be the weirdest crossover in any video game.